It's the 22nd of May 1936 in Royal Park, Melbourne. It's nearly 11 o'clock at night, but in a dimly lit corner of the park, a car is idling and the shadows of 4 people can be seen moving around inside. This is a dangerous place to linger after dark, as armed hold-ups have increased and the area is a known hotspot for violent crime. And 2 figures are creeping towards the idling vehicle. They approach on either side of the car before, to the horror of the occupants inside, each man draws a gun. "Stick 'em up," one of the men orders roughly. "Don't move or speak." Then several things happen very fast. One of the occupants of the car, a man in a pork pie hat sitting on the passenger seat, pulls out a gun of his own, while the second man outside the vehicle shouts, "It's Brophy! Don't shoot, Brophy!" Disregarding this, the passenger fires 2 shots at the men, but they miss, and in the back of the car, 2 women start screaming. The men outside fire back a total of 4 times, and the armed man in the front seat cries out as 3 of the bullets strike his body. The 4th, meanwhile, punches a tyre of the vehicle, and the 2 shooters hightail it out of the park and take off into the night. The badly injured passenger asks to be driven to St Vincent's Hospital, although the punctured tyre renders this impossible and they are forced to stop just outside Royal Park. The 2 women do what they can to stop the bleeding while the driver runs for help and returns with a passing motorist. As the 2 men help the badly wounded passenger into the car, the Good Samaritan is shocked to see that it is none other than Detective Superintendent John O'Connell Brophy, possibly the most famous detective in all of Victoria. But there's no time for questions. Brophy has been shot in the face, chest and arm and urgently needs medical attention. But strangely, he's changed his mind and doesn't want to go to the hospital and insists on being taken to police headquarters in St Kilda to make a report on what just happened. The driver ignores this and instead takes Brophy to St Vincent's in nearby Fitzroy. Fortunately, it turns out that none of his wounds are serious and the doctors are able to patch him up. Brophy's boss, Chief Commissioner of Police Sir Thomas Blamey, meets him at the hospital and releases a statement to the media before Brophy has even been discharged. Blamey tells waiting journalists who are camped outside the hospital demanding to know more about what happened that there is absolutely nothing to worry about. Brophy had accidentally shot himself in the forearm while cleaning his gun. Everybody could go home now and no, Victoria Police would not be answering any further questions about the matter. The end. Now, within the space of 3 days, Blamey had been outed as a liar and a second statement was quickly rushed out. Yes, Victoria Police admitted the Chief Commissioner lied. Sorry, not sorry. And Brophy had actually gone to Royal Park to meet an informant when he had been surprised and shot by 2 armed bandits. Police were not looking for the shooters and Brophy was going to make a full recovery. Now, this is really the end. Period. No more questions. Go the hell away. But by now, the media could smell a rat. In fact, they could smell several rats. And as more and more information leaked out about the circumstances of the shooting, it became apparent that something very strange was going on. Under tremendous public pressure, the Victorian government set up a royal commission to inquire into the circumstances of Brophy's shooting and to ask why Victoria Police had covered it up. Brophy escaped from the commission unscathed, while the already scandal-ridden Blamey was forced to resign in disgrace. But the question of what Brophy had been doing in Royal Park, and in the company of 3 civilians, was never satisfactorily answered. And why had Blamey and other senior police tried to cover it up with such an easily disprovable lie? I'm Juliana, and you're listening to The Skeptical Historian. Hello, my fellow skeptics, and thank you so much, as always, for tuning in. I am coming to you today from the sovereign and unceded land of the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung people, and would like to acknowledge their elders past and present and extend that respect to any and all Indigenous peoples who are listening today. Shout out also to Studio 4 at the State Library of Victoria, where this episode is being recorded, For more information or to book the studio yourself, please head to www.slv.vic.gov.au. That's www.slv.vic.gov.au. Now, let us return to the very strange events of the 22nd of May, 1936. Long-term listeners of my podcast will have heard of this event before, as I discussed it briefly in Season 1 during the episode Bad Cops, Blamey, Badge 80 and the Police Strike of 1923. You can go back and listen to that if you feel so inclined. Side note, it's actually still my favourite episode that I've ever done. Now, that episode was about Brophy's infamous boss, Chief Commissioner Thomas Blamey, who was a very, very bad cop who happened to actually do a few good things, but would ultimately be undone by his penchant for lies and corruption. His career was plagued with scandal, and he was forced to resign in disgrace after the Royal Commission into Brophy's shooting revealed not only his initial lie, but a string of lies and an increasingly desperate attempt to stop further investigation into the event. Brophy himself, as mentioned earlier, emerged mostly unscathed, although the peculiar circumstances around the shooting have continued to attract interest in the 90 years or so since the bullets were fired. We'll examine some of these rumours in a moment, but first of all, who was Detective Superintendent John O'Connell Brophy? Brophy was born in Bacchus Marsh in 1878, and he was the oldest of 4 children born to parents John Sr. and Ellen Brophy. Now, in keeping with the customs of the time, his middle name, O'Connell, had been his mother's maiden name. He joined the police force in 1900, and 2 years later he married local woman Evelyn Gee, with whom he would go on to have 2 children. Their daughter, Jessie, was born in 1903, and they had a son, Francis, who was born in 1906. Brophy demonstrated his prowess as an investigator early in his career, and he was transferred to the then relatively new Crime Investigation Bureau in 1912. Now, this was considered an elite unit and was quite a step up for a police officer just out of the first decade of his career. This was a time when the only way to advance in the police force was via seniority, so someone had to die or retire before someone else could get a promotion. So it was very, very rare for relatively new officers to get elite assignments. Now, not long after this, tragedy struck the family in 1919 when Brophy's son Francis died aged just 13. I haven't been able to find out if he died of Spanish flu or not, but the timing is correct, although I can't say for certain if this is what killed the young man. Now, by the time of his son's death, Brophy's fame as a detective was second only to that of his friend and fellow detective Fred Piggott, and his star continued to rise throughout the 1920s. Brophy and Piggott worked together on some of the most infamous cases of the decade, including the Gun Alley murder, which sadly saw an innocent man executed and will certainly be the subject of a future podcast. And both Piggott and Brophy frequently arrested notorious Melbourne gangster Joseph Squizzy Taylor while trying to break up his lucrative and violent bootlegging empire. Among the Melbourne street gangs, there was even a rhyme about the pair of detectives. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. If Brophy doesn't get you, then Piggott must. Brophy's work continued in the 1930s when the Great Depression hit Australia's shores, bringing with it anger, desperation and, alarmingly, the rise of fascism. This was also the era of baton charges against peaceful protesters and of police shooting into unarmed crowds. With unemployment so high, poorly paid police constables were afraid to speak up against their increasingly corrupt chief commissioner because he controlled their hardship fund, which many of them were relying on to feed their families and keep a roof over their head. Undoubtedly, some of these dissatisfied constables were among those who leaked to the press about Brophy's shooting, and it was their information that would eventually spark the Royal Commission. Now, the shooting itself could not have come at a worse time for Brophy, although there is not really a good time to be shot, I admit, because just weeks earlier he had finally been promoted to the head of the CIB after his immediate boss had at long last retired. Now, Brophy himself was only 2 years away from the compulsory retirement age of 60 when he was shot and when he was promoted to head of CIB, and it really was a sad bookend to what was otherwise quite an illustrious career. At the same time as the investigation into the shooting was unfolding, Another scandal erupted when a senior judge blew the whistle on police brutality against detainees and provided damning evidence that officers were encouraged to routinely beat confessions out of suspects. Brophy was among those accused of partaking in these assaults throughout his career, and while these accusations were probably true, he was never among those police prosecuted. This is probably because by 1936, the year he was shot, Brophy's fame was such among the public that it was assumed he could do no wrong. Whether he had such a godlike view of himself was unclear, but if Detective Brophy said it was so, then the public was going to believe it. In most cases. This was part of the reason why a royal commission had to be called to investigate the shooting at Royal Park. Brophy, Blamey and a large section of senior police had actively engaged in a cover-up, albeit a very clumsy one, which shook the public's confidence in their star detective. Once the press definitively revealed that Brophy had been shot 3 times by armed assailants, not once by accident while cleaning his gun, and that Victoria Police was doing nothing about it, they wanted answers. There was also a large cohort of politicians who were tired of corruption in Victoria Police and wanted Blamey's head on a spike, so they jumped at the chance to nail the Chief Commissioner for something definitive. The Conservative Victorian government stood firmly behind Blamey and did not want a royal commission, but they were a minority government and needed the support of the opposition to implement their policy agenda. If they upset the opposition, they risked being deadlocked for the rest of their term, and so reluctantly agreed. So, what did the commission find? Well, the funny thing about the commission, at least from my perspective, is that while it had very wide terms of reference, it didn't find out much at all. In my opinion, the purpose of the Royal Commission, despite it ostensibly being called to investigate the circumstances of Brophy's shooting and why the police had covered it up, was really about getting rid of Blamey. The politicians didn't actually care who had shot Brophy, and if Victoria Police didn't want to go looking for the shooters, well, that was their problem. What the politicians did care about was Blamey's long-standing corrupt behaviour, and the fact that he had at long last been caught red-handed in one of his lies. In this case, a lie to the press in the hours after the shooting. He had then made things even worse for himself by continuing to lie to everyone else about it for weeks afterwards. And this finally gave the politicians the ammunition they needed to get rid of him. That said, the commission did investigate the shooting, and some very interesting facts came from the testimony of the various witnesses. So, while we'll never know exactly what happened that night, there are a few theories worth considering. In the interests of historical accuracy, let's just have a very quick look at the initial claim made by Blamey to reporters outside the hospital, that Brophy accidentally shot himself while cleaning his gun. Blamey might have got away with this if he hadn't made the lie so specific. He told reporters that Brophy had shot himself in the right forearm, which had resulted in a fracture. Like most of Blamey's lies throughout his police career, there was a grain of truth here. Brophy had been shot in the right forearm and he did have a broken arm. The problem was that Brophy had also been shot in the face and chest, not just the arm, and that he was a right-handed gunman. And this was well known. There were photographs of him in the press holding his gun in his right hand. Blamey not only made no mention of these other 2 wounds in his initial press conference, he also claimed Brophy had only been shot in the right forearm. Now, for a right-handed gunman to shoot themselves in the right forearm would require some serious contortion, and while I'm no ballistics expert, I'm fairly confident the only way for such an injury to be remotely possible would be if a bullet had ricocheted in the vehicle. We know this didn't happen because there was no interior gunshot damage to the car, and the only shot which hit the car was the one that punctured the tyre. Blamey's claim downplaying Brophy's injuries and insisting they were accidentally self-inflicted unravelled within a day. Journalists not only asked the obvious question we have examined about how a right-handed gunman could shoot themselves in the right forearm, but hospital sources shared the true extent of Brophy's injuries with journalists, who then had a field day forcing Blamey to explain himself. Now, the fact that hospital staff leaked this information to the media does raise serious ethical issues. The journalists never revealed their sources. Journalists never do, for obvious reasons. But hospital staff are not supposed to disclose details of a patient's condition to anyone, let alone the media, without the patient's consent. This was as true in 1936 as it is now, with some exceptions, but even with this being said, I'm not surprised that hospital staff felt the need to speak up in the face of Blamey's lies. While none of Brophy's wounds had been life-threatening, the detective was very lucky to have survived. The shot to his cheek exited through his neck, just missing a major artery, and the shot to his chest would have been fatal, it was right over his heart, if the bullet hadn't been deflected by the buckle of his braces. But back to Blamey's claims about Brophy's injuries being self-inflicted. Once it became clear this was rubbish, everyone involved admitted that Brophy had been shot by a person or persons unknown. That much continues to be clear to this day. Brophy was shot by someone, but who were they and why did they open fire? Here we can start to consider the theories put forward to the Royal Commission and speculated on in the press. The first to be examined by the press and commented on by the commissioners was that Brophy had gone to the park to meet a lover, presumably one of the women he was in the car with, and had been shot by her jealous husband. The two ladies with him that night were friends of the Brophy family, Madeline Orr and Elise Phillips, while the driver and fourth occupant of the vehicle was William Mayer. Mayer was employed as the head barman at the City Hotel, sometimes called the Tattersall's Hotel, which was owned by Mrs. Orr, and he also worked regularly as her chauffeur. It was Mrs. Orr's car that the four of them were in when the shooters opened fire, and Mayer had driven Brophy to Royal Park at the detective's request, according to testimony given at the Royal Commission. Mrs. Orr was a widow, but Mrs. Phillips's husband was very much alive and kicking, so for the jealous husband theory to have any believability, Mr. Phillips would have had to be the shooter. Now, he strenuously denied this when he was called to give evidence to the commission, and said that he did not believe his wife was having an affair or that she had ever had an affair with Brophy, and that he and his wife were still living together and on very good terms. He said he didn't know what had happened that night until he'd been told about it, and most importantly, he was able to provide evidence as to his whereabouts at the time of the shooting. He was at home and not in Royal Park. The jealous husband theory was first put forward by the media based on Brophy's reputation. He was quite an infamous Lothario, and they ran with it while they unravelled the identities of Mrs. Orr and Mrs. Phillips. They had no idea who these women were when they first printed the theory, which is stunningly irresponsible journalism, and then found themselves in a sticky situation when it was revealed that one was a widow and the other's husband had an alibi for the time of the shooting. Mr. Phillips had in fact only been called to the Royal Commission at the insistence of the Counsel for the Sun and the Herald, two of the newspapers present, and as soon as he was in the witness box, the lawyer for the newspapers, Mr. Ham, decided that he did not wish to question him. The judge called Ham out on this and pointed out that the newspapers he represented had been among those who had printed the infuriated husband theory, and he should ask Mr. Phillips some questions. The questions simply confirmed what had already come out of the media's own sleuthing. Phillips was not the shooter. In my opinion, the newspapers really should have confirmed the identities of the women before assuming both Brophy and at least one of the ladies was having an affair, but the laws regulating the newspapers were rather lax back then. It would be decades before any serious code of conduct for journalists was enacted, and it took even longer to pass laws requiring news outlets ensure any allegations they were publishing were backed by reasonable evidence. The commission found, and I agree, that Brophy was not shot by a jealous husband, and they dismissed the idea that he had gone to Royal Park for an illicit rendezvous with a lover. I also agree with this point too. If nothing else, why bring two witnesses, one of whom happens to be a close friend of your wife, if you're having an affair? However, the question of why Orr and Phillips were in the car and why Brophy used Mrs. Orr's private car and driver rather than taking a police car and driver was never examined, nor was it ever satisfactorily explained. Brophy admitted under oath that he'd lied in the days after the shooting, first by going along with Blamey's story that he had accidentally shot himself, and then he had claimed he'd been alone in the car, and he said he'd made these statements because he didn't want to drag his friends' reputations through the mud. The commission accepted this explanation, and while it makes sense, doesn't account for why they were there in the first place. Now, I want you to hold that thought. We'll come back to it in a moment as we move on to the next theory. The second scenario considered by the commission was that Brophy had gone to Royal Park to meet an informant and had been surprised by the two gunmen. This was the statement made after Blamey's lie was uncovered and is the story Brophy stuck to for the rest of his life. A detective going out to meet an informant would not have been unusual, but most detectives, be they from 1936 or 2025, don't take their friends with them to such meetings, if for no other reason than it could compromise the identity of their source. For obvious reasons, police, like journalists, don't reveal the identities of their informants, so taking Orr and Phillips with him in a private car driven by Mayer was reckless behaviour on Brophy's part. Apart from possibly compromising his source, it also put the three civilians accompanying him at risk. Brophy was a very well-known detective. In fact, he was almost the face of Victoria Police by 1936. So by bringing his friends to meet with one of his informants, he was potentially providing leverage which could be used against him. Police informants usually have criminal ties themselves, and given Brophy's notoriety among the underworld, his friends could have been dragged into some very nasty stuff indeed. The Royal Commission ignored this, and not only accepted that Brophy had gone to Royal Park to meet an informant, but also that he had done nothing improper by bringing Orr and Phillips, or being driven by Mayer. The issue of the informant, though, is a very interesting one, because if Brophy was expecting to meet them in Royal Park, they never turned up. According to the testimony of all four occupants in the car, they had been at the park only minutes when the two bandits tried to rob them. Now, this in of itself is not strange. The park was a known hotspot for armed hold-ups, and few people were prepared to linger there after dark. So the next question that arises is, was it a setup? The Royal Commission did not investigate this possibility, but I think it's worth reflecting on. A famous detective goes to meet an informant who never shows up and is shot by armed robbers within minutes of arriving. Given Brophy had plenty of enemies in Melbourne's underworld who would have liked to silence him permanently, it's not outside the realm of possibility that the shooting could have been a bungled professional hit. Brophy only survived, after all, due to sheer luck, and given he was bleeding extensively, it is quite possible that the shooters really thought they'd finished the job. And if it was a hit, it does seem to have been relatively well planned. Lure Brophy to the park by telling him an informer wants to speak to him, or get the informant to do the luring, pick a relatively isolated spot, then leap out of the bushes and... Sounds great until you start to peel back the layers. There are two incidents in particular which strongly suggest this wasn't a planned hit on Brophy, and both of them come from the shooters. The first is that they announced themselves. One of the men said, "Stick 'em up, don't move or speak," when he approached the car. If he had been a hitman expecting Detective Brophy, loudly proclaiming he was present and that he was armed would have been a very stupid move. Of course, famed crime journalist John Sylvester has made the point that most hitmen generally have an IQ comparable to that of a sea cucumber, so it could have been that this guy was just, well, stupid. Now, I probably shouldn't insult sea cucumbers like that, actually. For being brainless scavengers, they're actually pretty clever. When threatened, a sea cucumber can expel its toxic internal organs from its own body in the direction of a predator, leaving them to die a painful death as it gobbles up what it thinks is a tasty meal. As for the sea cucumber, well, its organs will grow back within a couple of weeks with no damage to the animal itself. I'd like to see a hitman who can do that. However, I have digressed, so allow me to return to considering whether the attack on Brophy was a botched hit. Now, I have never killed anyone, but like most of you I'm sure, I've read about hits in the media and I've listened to the odd police press conference or two regarding gangland or underworld shootings. As many of you may have also guessed, given I quoted him above, I'm also an avid reader of anything bylined by John Sylvester, who is, in my very humble opinion, certainly the greatest crime journalist in Australia and possibly the greatest journalist in this country, full stop. He's written more than a few words on how hitmen usually operate, and I've drawn on his expertise when considering if the shooters were actively after Brophy. Most hits happen fast, before the target knows the shooter or shooters are there, and hitmen don't waste time yelling. As soon as they've fired, they skedaddle. As for leaving witnesses, well, that really depends on the hitman. Some of the hitmen who worked for the more notorious crime families during what became known as the Underbelly Wars were callous enough to murder innocent bystanders who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, or even decimate entire families, while others were careful to catch their targets alone. But something all of them, and I do mean every single one that was covered by the press anyway, had in common was that they surprised their victims, killed them quickly, and left. They didn't make their presence known until they were ready to shoot. There's no reason to believe that a hitman in 1936 would have behaved any differently, especially if he knew the target was a policeman who was likely to be armed and on guard. Brophy responded very quickly when the two men approached and got 2 shots off at them before they were able to return fire. Given he was sitting in a car in an armed robbery hotspot, possibly waiting for an informant, it makes perfect sense that he would have had his gun in easy reach. Now, the second phrase uttered by the gunman that leads me to believe it was not a hit was that they were surprised when they recognised Brophy. If you think back to the immersion at the beginning of the podcast, which was based on testimony from the Royal Commission, one of the shooters exclaimed, "It's Brophy! Don't shoot Brophy!" In a targeted hit, the hitman knows who it is they're killing and doesn't generally feel the need to yell about it. But what I find most interesting, though, is not the surprised exclamation itself, but the second part of this sentence. "Don't shoot Brophy!" There's a meme which does the rounds regularly on social media blaring, "Punctuation saves lives!" usually accompanied by a silly sentence or two showing how important it is to put your comma in the right place, lest anyone think you had your grandmother for lunch last weekend. All the reports from 1936 place a comma directly after "don't shoot," suggesting that the shooter recognised Brophy, saw the detective was armed, and in that split second begged him not to fire. But the gunman was never caught, and it was not this second man who fired, but the first. So could he have been talking to his companion? Instead of saying, "Don't shoot me, Brophy," was he instead telling his friend, "Don't shoot, it's Detective Brophy"? We'll never know, but it's something I can't help wondering about. Now, of course, shooting police officers is always a bad idea under any circumstances, let alone in 1936 when the death penalty was still on the books and the public believed the police officer in question could do no wrong. Had these men been caught, they would have had a one-way ticket to the gallows. The man who actually pulled the trigger may have felt he was justified in doing so, given Brophy fired at him first, but it doesn't work like that when the person you've tried to stick up is a policeman. So, a hit? Very unlikely. But what was it then? Could it honestly have been nothing more than a robbery gone wrong? The Royal Commission didn't even consider this possibility, but I think it has merit. Brophy was a famous detective, and perhaps, just perhaps, his star status blinded investigators to the idea that it could have been an ordinary crime. If Mayer had simply driven Orr and Phillips to the park without Detective Brophy in the car, no one would have thought it strange if the two women were held up at gunpoint or even if their driver was shot. Brophy's presence meant it was assumed the crime had some link to him. But maybe it didn't. Maybe the two shooters were just the usual nighttime prowlers who haunted Royal Park looking for a score. Brophy, Mayer, Orr and Phillips were sitting in a dark car in an isolated section of the park and would have looked like an easy mark. Nothing was stolen because once the shooters knew who they had shot and saw there were multiple people in the vehicle, they spooked and fled. They may have thought Mayer was armed perhaps, or once it dawned on them that they'd just shot Victoria's most famous detective, they decided anything they might have been able to take simply wasn't worth it. Now, this is all speculation, of course, but I really don't think the shooting was about Brophy. I think it was about two armed and dangerous men who thought they had a mark and instead found themselves faced with an armed policeman. In their shock and panic, they acted the same way they would have done had any other target shot at them, and then legged it once they realised how serious things were about to become. But even if this is the case, even if I am right, and we'll never know, it still doesn't answer the most pressing question in this whole strange scenario. What was Brophy doing in Royal Park in the first place? Was he really meeting an informant? And if so, why had he picked and/or agreed to see them in such a dangerous spot, especially after dark? Well, I have a theory about that. In the hours before the shooting, Brophy arrived at Mrs. Orr's bar and asked Maya if the chauffeur and head barman could drive him to Royal Park later that evening on a little job. Both Brophy and Maya confirmed this conversation had taken place, and Maya said he agreed to help the detective out. In fact, it appears Maya regularly drove Brophy on little jobs, in Mrs. Orr's car no less, based on the testimony the two men provided. But, like the good employee he was, Maya let Mrs. Orr know that the detective had asked for his help, and probably sought her permission before going out. Now, while we don't know for certain this happened, it would have been unusual for a close personal servant, like a chauffeur, not to seek permission from his employer before going out on a late-night errand for somebody else. Remember too that Brophy and Mrs. Orr were close friends, and her bar was one of Brophy's favourite watering holes. And it is here that I think I have the answers to both why Brophy was in Royal Park and why his informant never turned up. I think the informant was there. In fact, I think the informant was already in the car. I think that Detective Brophy's informant was none other than William Mayer, and I think he'd been feeding Brophy information for a while. As well as the chauffeur, Mayer was the head barman at the inner city hotel Mrs. Orr owned. And people drink whether they want to celebrate or commiserate, and nothing, and I do mean nothing, loosens lips like alcohol. Given Brophy was a family friend of Orr, Mayer would have seen him regularly, and it would not have been difficult for him to pass on information he heard in the hotel to the detective. The hotel was also close to Royal Park, where the frequent armed hold-ups were taking place, and also, interestingly, to a shoe factory in North Fitzroy, which had been held up at gunpoint just weeks before. The thieves had broken in, assaulted the manager, terrorised the staff, and made off with hundreds of pounds in cash. Now, Brophy was working that case, and if Mayer had suddenly seen poor men flush with cash at the bar, or heard whispers about who the robbers were from the many patrons, it would have made sense for him to tell Brophy about it. I think that Mayer had heard that some of the North Fitzroy robbers would be in Royal Park that night, and Brophy wanted him to take him to the park for a stakeout. As for why Mrs. Orr and Mrs. Phillips would have been in the car, I think that can be answered with further reasonable speculation. Perhaps Mayer had come to his employer requesting permission to take Brophy on a little job one too many times, and Orr had become concerned about what her chauffeur was up to. If so, she may have insisted on accompanying Brophy and Mayer to the park to ensure nothing untoward was happening. It's also possible that she may have been suspicious about why two grown men so frequently went out together alone and met at parks in her car. However, given Mrs. Orr was a respectable widow, she may not have wanted to be seen alone with a famous philanderer like Detective Brophy. Society at the time would not have counted Mayer, a servant, as a person in this equation had Brophy and Orr been spotted driving together. And Orr could have insisted on bringing a lady friend to protect her reputation. Bringing someone she knew, but who also knew Brophy, makes sense in this situation, which may have been why Mrs. Phillips was there. Now, given Brophy was only going to the park to watch and see if Mayer could identify the robbers, he may have thought the mission so dangerous that the ladies couldn't come. Now, if my speculations are true, he may have also agreed to their company to ensure that Mrs. Orr didn't interfere, directly or otherwise, with his ability to continue getting valuable information from Mayer. There is also the possibility that Brophy overestimated himself and assumed that, if anything did go wrong, he would be able to protect the ladies from harm. In this, he was proved wrong, and it was sheer luck that the men who shot him were not as cold-blooded as some of their past and present fellows. The shooters could have very easily shot Mayer, Orr and Phillips if they'd wanted to, and left Brophy to bleed out, or perhaps finish the job. Certainly Mayer would have tried to intervene had the men attempted to shoot his employer and her close friend. It was not uncommon for a chauffeur to double as a bodyguard in the 1930s. But unless he was armed, it is likely he would have been the first one shot before the criminals silenced the ladies. Thankfully, this didn't happen and everyone came out of the encounter alive, but there is one final question worth answering before we wrap up today. Why did police fail to even look for the shooters? They were never found, and my guess is as good as anyone's, but I've got to guess all the same. I think it was because they already knew who they were. If Brophy was in the park wanting to identify the armed robbers from the North Fitzroy gang, he must have either known who they were or had a very good idea what they looked like. In the weeks after the shooting, Mayer was tracked down by the press at a barber shop and was bailed up by reporters while he was having a shave, which can't have been a pleasant experience. They wanted to show him photos of the men who had robbed the North Fitzroy shoe store, and he identified one of them as the man who had shot Brophy in the park. Now, he may have just been lying because he wanted to get out of the barber shop and back to work, but I think there is something to this. If Brophy and the police already knew who the men were, either because they'd been told by Mayer or other informants or through their own investigations, and knew that they could get them for other crimes, making a scene about them shooting a police detective would have hampered their investigation efforts. Brophy's clumsy attempts to protect the identity and reputation of his close friends, and possibly to maintain the anonymity of a source, coupled with his boss's stupid lies in the immediate aftermath, meant the case grew far larger than it ever should have, until it finally ended in public spectacle and a royal commission. A bit of truth in the beginning from Blamey, and a brief public statement from Brophy could have headed off the wild speculation that arose even as the detective was lying in hospital, but I suppose if they'd done that, we wouldn't have this very strange story to pick over almost 90 years later. And I'm sure you'll agree, skeptics, it's the strange and mysterious stories that make the best history. So, what happened to Brophy after the Royal Commission? Well, he continued to work as a detective for another 2 years until he reached the compulsory retirement age of 60 in 1938. He died just 8 years later at the age of 68. His funeral and burial were both private at the request of his family, and he was buried in the same plot as his son Francis. His wife, Evelyn, would also be buried there when she died in 1952. Now, there is some speculation that there may have been a fracture in the relationship between Brophy and his wife in later years, as once he retired, he did not live in the family home but moved in with his daughter and son-in-law, who owned a pub and lived above it. While it may have simply been that Evelyn Brophy was tired of her husband's many affairs and their marriage fractured, there may have also been something much more insidious at play: trauma. Like many police detectives, Brophy was exposed to some of the most horrific scenes a human can ever be exposed to, and that leaves a mark. He also lived and worked at a time when trauma was not understood, and men especially were expected to just buck up and keep a stiff upper lip. Once his days as a police officer were over, once that continuous distraction wasn't there, perhaps some demons may have caught up with him. It is now well documented that things like trauma and untreated PTSD can severely damage relationships, so if it was happening, and if Brophy did have any kind of untreated trauma, perhaps he and his wife simply chose to live apart in his final years. He was very close with his adult daughter and her children, and he may have felt safer and more comfortable with them, away from the memories of his long years as Victoria's most revered policeman. Whatever the truth, Evelyn Brophy attended her husband's funeral and burial, and she gave instruction to be buried with him when she passed away. This could have also had a religious aspect to it. The Brophies were very devout Catholics, so it probably wouldn't have occurred to them to even consider a divorce, even if things were going badly in their marriage. Their daughter, Jessie Redmond, died in 1969, but she was not buried in the family plot but with her husband Jim in another cemetery. The Brophy-Redmond descendants still live in Melbourne today, and many are active in the police history space, keeping the memory of Detective Brophy and his hard-working fellows of the Depression era alive and well. And that's all I have for you today, skeptics. Thank you so much for joining me once again. If you're looking to get in touch, I'm easy to find online. Just search for Juliana Byers on LinkedIn and Instagram. And don't forget to have a look at my website while you're at it. It's www.skepticalhistory.com. That's skeptical with a K. And I'll see you next episode for another take on the mystery that is history. Bye now. The Skeptical Historian is researched, produced and hosted by me, Juliana Bias. You can find a full list of resources used in my research by going to my rss.com podcast page, clicking on the relevant episode, opening the transcript and scrolling down to find the sources. That's rss.com/podcasts/the-skeptical-historian. Sound effects are by Adobe Creative Cloud, Pixabay and Epidemic Sound, used under the appropriate license. The music track The Whistle Funk by Telsonic was also used appropriately. Podcast hosting is by rss.com. See you next time, skeptics.